Alright, let's talk about rules. I think it's a fair statement to say that any savvy competitor, coach, knowledgeable parent or fan, and certainly a referee should have a good understanding of the written rules of any tournament. But there's some challenges behind that. The first is that a wrong assumption is that scoring scenarios or rules in general are shared across or defined the same across all tournaments. And it's just not the case. I mean, some literally will say we use so-and-so's rules. But short of that, there may be commonalities. For instance, a takedown is 2 points. That premise, or that one line, that one written line, may be accurate across many scoring platforms. But the details behind that and all the scenarios associated with that could be enforced very differently. Frankly, one organization that I work for extensively also has a 3-point takedown, which is rather uncommon. And you wouldn't know that had you not read the written rules. But the reason that it's hard to understand a variety of scenarios or how they're enforced by a tournament is because the written rules can vary greatly. For instance, one organization can have a 2-page written rule book. Another can have a 60-page with pictures detailed rule book. Now, despite the large difference in the detail, the commonality between those two written rule books is neither contains everything you would possibly need to know to either compete or officiate in the tournament. Now, that may not sound reasonable, but I can assure you that it's the case. Even the most detailed rule books have scenarios that are either not included or the way it's written could be interpreted more than one way. In fact, a lot of organizations give rules seminars or rule certifications, they're called. And the reality is, when you go to them, what they really are is merely someone reading to you the written rules. Well, you could save yourself $60 to $80 by reading the rules yourself if that's all you're going to garner out of taking one of those rule certifications, unless you're really hell-bent on hanging a certificate on the wall. The reality is the benefit of those rule certification classes are actually to go in there having read the rules and then to ask the questions of both interpretation of what is written as well as all the things you can think of that are not written from somebody that supposedly is knowledgeable on the subject. A lot of organizations don't provide any certification, any formalized certification. What they'll have is maybe a quick demo before the tournament where the general rules will be discussed. And a lot of times all you get is a takedown is 2 points. But if you think about all the complexities associated with takedowns and the infinite scenarios you can probably come up with from sambo, jiu-jitsu, judo, and wrestling, you know that just knowing takedown is 2 points is wholly inadequate for you to either compete, to coach, or certainly to referee. So I've already explained how you go about learning more, but from an organizational standpoint, the challenge is, how do I get all my referees to do things the same way? And philosophically, the challenge is that these rules, or the unwritten rules I'm speaking of, are not necessarily right or wrong. They're just a decision that's made whether you want to include and how you want to enforce certain scenarios. I'll give you an example related to our takedown is 2 points. A wrestler, someone does a wrestling snap down to all fours, circles around to the back and controls the hips while his opponent remains in a turtle position. He keeps him there for a 3 count. Is that a takedown? there's no right or wrong answer there. It's how do you want to enforce it? I'm sure if you were someone with a wrestling background, you'd say, of course that's a takedown. He was on his feet, now he's on the ground. If you were a judo player, you might say, no, that's not a takedown. I didn't put him on his back, even for an instant. So the audience that the tournament is appealing to is going to be very relevant to how they enforce that. And there's got to be some kind of discussion with the referees before they're sent out there to say that, hey, a snap down to controlling the hips on all fours is a takedown, because what will happen is you'll have one ring that gives 2 points. The ring next to that will see it and give an advantage, and the ring next to that, the guy will call it no score. Same exact scenario. In fact, I've been at tournaments where a competitor would come over to me and say, hey, why, when I did this, did the ref over there give me 2 points and this guy didn't score it at all? And that's just a bad, maybe a miscommunication or a poor education for the referees about how to treat a specific scenario. Now, again, I'm not making a moral judgment about whether that should or should not be a valid score. Those are always subjects of conversation, and when you select a tournament, you want to select one, I guess, that fits your particular style. A lot of traditional jiu-jitsu tournaments started to try to cater to more non-denominational grapplers like wrestlers, and to do that, they incorporated less typical judo-like techniques into their rule set. It, again, not right and wrong, it's just a question of who they're looking to appeal to and how they want to run their given tournament. So another example I'd like to give here is a detail around slamming and some of the confusion that can be created around a slamming rule. So the written rules may say no slamming and not offer much additional detail. And the reality is there are several scenarios we could think of that could fall within that category and could philosophically be treated differently. Do we mean when we say no slamming that anytime you're trapped in a submission and you use, altitude and impact on the mat to escape, that is slamming? Are we referring to any hard jarring contact to the mat, or only referring to, the back and the head? Are we referring to any high amplitude throw that results in landing on the head? Or any kind of takedown that results, or any kind of throw that results in an injury? Are we talking about specifically throws that are WWE style, where there's some theatrics and one competitor's carrying another one around and then puts them hard to the mat? We know that there are quality judo type throws that can result in someone getting hurt but are perfectly executed. So how do we know what we're calling a slam specifically if the rule is merely no slamming? Now, okay, there's a no slamming rule, but do we have to list out in writing each individual one so that everybody knows exactly what we're talking about? And frankly, could we write down every possible scenario that we could think of and still not have another one happen outside of that? One real life example that I'd like to give was quite a while ago, and it was female competitors. I'm going to say in like a lower rank division, like a blue belt division, where one female competitor did it like an arm drag to the backs while standing, and then jumped on her opponent's back, put the hooks in with a seatbelt. Now, the competitor that she had jumped on lost her balance and, like a tree in the forest, fell straight backwards onto her opponent, who in turn slammed her back and her head directly onto the mat, plus the weight of her competitor on top of her. Now, I issued an immediate DQ because my feeling was that in the spirit of competition and just basically jiu-jitsu, base is critically important, and that you should know that if someone's going to jump on your back, that you should properly maintain good base and not merely be knocked over like that tree in the forest. Now, philosophically, we could argue whether that was a good call or not, and I can say that maybe if I saw that today, I'd feel differently about it, but at the time, that seemed to make perfect sense to me. Now, no one had instructed me specifically, other than no slamming, that when I see that particular scenario, how to treat it. So I had to make an instantaneous judgment that may have been inconsistent with every other referee that would have seen it in that particular tournament. So how do you prepare correctly for that? And of course, the scenario I'm describing is very similar to the well-known circumstance that Marcelo Garcia and Enrico Rodriguez had at Abu Dhabi, although the circumstances were different. So the argument philosophically could be, is it a slam when my opponent intentionally falls backwards, as Enrico Rodriguez did to Marcelo, or in the circumstance I described where it was an accident, do we treat those differently? Well, if we say we base it on intent, and that's literally written in the rules, well, slamming is something that's done intentionally. How is it the referee's determination, or how does that further clarify that the referee could possibly know the intention of one competitor over the other? Granted, sometimes when you see it, it appears more obvious. But sometimes it is borderline. You literally don't know why it happened. You just know that it did. So it puts you in the same quandary as a referee to enforce the written rules, yet you're no better informed to make what's considered the correct decision, and you'll probably hear it from either one side or the other. Or your peers in the same tournament might do it differently or think differently than you. So I just wanted to add that as, additional gray area for thought. The challenge, though, again, is going to be, does everybody understand fully how these different scenarios are enforced? And I think, going back to my original statement of making opinions about the criticism, I see a lot of people making judgments about these philosophical right and wrongs, which are not related to enforcement. And part of the reason they can't confirm how it should be enforced is because it's not in the written rules. It's maybe a discussion with the referees behind the scenes that says, hey, when you see that, we give 2 points. Or we don't. Or it could be the situation I described where it hasn't had discussion and each guy treats it differently, and then people recognize it for that case by saying, hey, I saw some guys giving it and some guys not. So I guess to circle back around, understand that written rules are important, but they're not going to be the end all for all situations. And someone that has a written rules understanding, I consider it again a prerequisite or a cursory understanding of what's needed to be knowledgeable, particularly as a referee. And you really have to be asking these greater questions of, how do you want to enforce all these scenarios that I can think of? And I can tell you myself, even after 60 some odd tournaments officiating, I still see scenarios that make me question how to apply the rules. And I know when I go back to my peers and I ask them how they would do it, I get different answers. So understand that these variables do exist, and don't give yourself too much credit because you've got a certificate on the wall for a rules certification.